The relentless pounding of hooves against muddy earth matched the thundering of Priscilla Norwood's heart as she urged her horse forward through the deluge. Rain lashed against her face, each droplet like tiny needles piercing her skin. Behind her, the shouts of her husband's men grew fainter as the storm intensified, but she knew they wouldn't give up the chase easily. Charles Blackwell's men never did. The year was 1876, and Priscilla had been married to one of the most feared cattle barons in Nevada territory for 3 years too long. She had married Charles at 18, thinking his wealth and power would provide security. Instead, she had become a prisoner in her own home, subject to his volatile temper and controlling ways. Tonight, after witnessing him murder a ranch hand who had dared to defend her, Priscilla had grabbed what few possessions she could carry and fled into the stormy night. Charles would claim the boy had stolen from him, but Priscilla knew the truth. The ranch hand had intervened when Charles had struck her across the face at dinner. Now he was dead, and she would be next if she didn't escape. Her horse stumbled on the slippery ground, nearly sending her tumbling into the mud. Priscilla pulled back on the reins, trying to regain control. The poor animal was exhausted, its sides heaving with exertion. She couldn't push it much further, but stopping wasn't an option. Not when Charles's men were still on her trail. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the rugged landscape ahead. In that flash, Priscilla spotted a small cabin nestled among the pines at the edge of a clearing. Hope surged within her. Perhaps whoever lived there would offer shelter, at least until the storm passed. She steered her mount toward the cabin, praying that its occupant would be sympathetic to her plight. As she approached, she saw a light flickering in the window. Someone was home. Slipping from her horse, Priscilla's boots sank into the mud as she stumbled toward the door. Her sodden dress clung to her body, and her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face. She raised a trembling hand to knock, then hesitated. What if the occupant was one of Charles's friends? The cattle baron's influence stretched across most of northern Nevada. Before she could decide, the door swung open. A tall man stood framed in the doorway, a rifle held loosely in his hands. His face was partially shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, but she could see he was studying her intently. "Please," Priscilla gasped, her voice barely audible above the storm. "They're after me. I need help." The man's eyes shifted to look beyond her, scanning the darkness. He must have heard something she hadn't because his posture suddenly tensed. Without a word, he reached out and pulled her inside, closing the door quickly behind them. "Your horse will give you away," he said, his voice deep and rough. "Wait here." Before she could protest, he disappeared out the back door. Priscilla stood dripping on the wooden floor, uncertain what to do. The cabin was sparsely furnished but neat. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She moved closer to its warmth, her body beginning to shake from cold and fear. Minutes later, the man returned, his coat now as soaked as her dress. "I moved your horse to the lean-to out back," he explained. "Got her out of sight." "Thank you," Priscilla whispered. Now that they were in the light, she could see him properly. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was weathered from the sun but handsome, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a summer sky. He had the look of a man who spent his life outdoors, a cowboy or maybe a rancher. "You're running from someone," he stated rather than asked, setting his rifle against the wall. "Husband," Priscilla nodded, unable to find her voice. "I heard hoofbeats on the north trail," he said, moving to peek through the curtains. "They'll be looking for you. What's your name?" "Priscilla," she answered, then hesitated before adding, "Priscilla Norwood." Using her maiden name felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. "I'm Dawson Bailey," he replied, turning back to her. Most folks just call me Dawes." A shout from outside made them both freeze. Priscilla's heart lurched painfully in her chest as the sound of horses approaching reached her ears. Charles's men had found her trail. Dawson moved quickly, grabbing a blanket from a chest and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Stay quiet," he instructed, guiding her toward a ladder that led to a small loft. "Up there. Don't make a sound." Priscilla climbed the ladder, her wet skirts hampering her movements. The loft was little more than a sleeping area with a narrow bed and a trunk. She crouched in the shadows, pulling the blanket tightly around her as Dawson positioned himself by the door, rifle back in hand. A heavy knock rattled the cabin door. Priscilla held her breath, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound that might escape. "Who's there?" Dawson called, his tone casual but wary. "Blackwell's men," came the gruff response. "We're looking for a woman. Might have come this way." Dawson opened the door a crack, keeping his body positioned to block the view inside. "Haven't seen any woman," he said. "Been holed up here all evening on account of the storm. Mind if we take a look around?" The voice was insistent, suspicious. "Actually, I do mind," Dawson replied firmly. "It's late, and I don't take kindly to strangers barging into my home. If I see your missing woman, I'll be sure to let Blackwell know." There was a tense silence, and Priscilla feared the men would force their way in. Then another voice spoke up. "Her horse might have headed for the river crossing. We should check there before the trail washes away completely." After a moment of consideration, the first man grunted in agreement. "All right, Cowboy, but if we find out you're lying, Blackwell will hear about it." "I've got no quarrel with Blackwell," Dawson answered smoothly. "Good luck with your search." He closed the door firmly and remained still, listening as the horses moved away. Only when the sounds had completely faded did he look up toward the loft. "You can come down now," he called softly. "They're gone." Priscilla descended the ladder on shaky legs. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze. "You didn't have to help me." Dawson shrugged, setting his rifle aside. "I'm not in the habit of turning away folks in need, especially not on a night like this." He moved to stoke the fire, adding another log. "You're running from Blackwell, then?" "Charles Blackwell," she nodded, sinking down onto a chair near the fire. "He's my husband." Dawson let out a low whistle. "That's a dangerous man to cross." "I had no choice," Priscilla said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "He killed a boy tonight, a ranch hand who was just trying to protect me. He would have killed me too eventually." "I believe you," Dawson said simply. He moved to a small stove in the corner and poured hot water from a kettle into a mug, adding dried leaves from a tin. "Drink this. It'll warm you up." Priscilla accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm mug. "They'll come back," she said after taking a sip. "Charles won't give up easily." Dawson nodded, his expression serious. "No, I don't imagine he will, but they won't find you tonight. The rain's washing away your tracks even as we speak." He glanced toward the window where the storm continued unabated. "By morning, there won't be any sign you came this way. They'll never catch you now," he added with a small smile that transformed his solemn face. "At least not tonight." Priscilla felt a flicker of hope for the first time since she'd fled Blackwell Ranch. "Where are we?" she asked, realizing she had no idea how far she had ridden. "About 15 miles northeast of Verde," Dawson replied, taking a seat across from her. "I work for the Wilson spread, but I stay out here. Prefer my privacy." 15 miles wasn't nearly far enough, Priscilla thought. Charles's influence extended throughout the region. She needed to get much farther away, perhaps all the way to California. As if reading her thoughts, Dawson said, "You'll need to put more distance between you and Blackwell come morning." "Where were you heading?" "West," Priscilla answered. "I thought maybe San Francisco." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. Good choice. Big city, easy to disappear in. But you'll need help getting there. I have some money, she said, though the amount she had managed to take would hardly get her all the way to California. Money's not the only thing you need, Dawson replied. Blackwell's got friends all along the main routes. You'll need to travel the back trails, and those can be dangerous for a woman alone. Priscilla felt despair creeping back. She hadn't thought through her escape beyond getting away from the ranch. What am I going to do? She whispered, more to herself than to him. Dawson was quiet for a long moment, studying her. Finally, he spoke. I could help you, he offered. Get you to California, I mean. Priscilla looked up in surprise. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know enough, he said simply. I know Blackwell's reputation. No woman deserves to be treated the way he treats his wives. Wives, Priscilla repeated, confused. Dawson's expression grew grim. You're not his first. His previous wife died under questionable circumstances 2 years before you came along. Fell down the stairs, they said. But folks had seen the bruises. A chill ran through Priscilla that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She had heard whispers about a previous Mrs. Blackwell, but never the full story. Charles had always silenced any mention of her. I can't ask you to risk your life for me, she said finally. Charles will come after me with everything he has. I'm not afraid of Blackwell, Dawson replied, a hardness entering his voice. And I won't sit by while he hunts down an innocent woman. Before Priscilla could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows, drawing their attention. The storm was intensifying. You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death, Dawson said, rising from his chair. He moved to a trunk and pulled out a shirt and a pair of trousers. These will be too big, but they are dry. You can change behind that screen. He nodded toward a wooden folding screen in the corner. Priscilla accepted the clothes gratefully. Behind the screen, she struggled out of her sodden dress, the fabric clinging stubbornly to her skin. Dawson's clothes were indeed too large, but they were warm and dry. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs as best she could before emerging from behind the screen. Dawson had his back to her, giving her privacy. He had placed her dress near the fire to dry and was now pouring more tea. Thank you, she said, causing him to turn. Something flickered in his eyes as he took in the sight of her in his clothes, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. You should rest, he said, handing her a fresh mug of tea. Take the bed upstairs. I'll keep watch down here. Priscilla wanted to protest that she couldn't take his bed, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. The events of the evening, the desperate ride through the storm, and the constant fear had drained her completely. She nodded, too tired to argue. We'll figure things out in the morning, Dawson assured her. You're safe for now. As Priscilla climbed back up to the loft, she wondered if she would ever truly feel safe again. But for tonight, at least, she had found a temporary haven from the storm, both the one raging outside and the one that had been her marriage. The bed was simple but comfortable, the blankets clean and warm. As she lay down, she could hear Dawson moving around below, the soft scrape of a chair being positioned near the door, the creak of wood as he settled in for his vigil. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness, though she knew he couldn't hear her. She closed her eyes, listening to the rain drumming on the roof overhead, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear of what the morning might bring. Dawn broke with surprising clarity after the violence of the night storm. Priscilla woke to sunlight streaming through a small window in the loft. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar confines of her bed at Blackwell Ranch. The rough texture of homespun blankets brought reality crashing back. She sat up quickly, listening for sounds from below. The cabin was quiet, but she could smell coffee brewing. Dawson must be awake. Her dress was still damp, so she continued wearing his borrowed clothes as she descended the ladder. She found Dawson at the stove, frying bacon in a cast iron pan. He looked up as she reached the bottom rung. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you again for your help." He nodded, turning his attention back to the bacon. "Hungry, it's nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going." Starving, Priscilla realized. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's noon meal, and even then, her appetite had been diminished by Charles's dark mood. Dawson served up bacon and beans on tin plates, along with thick slices of bread. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke. "I've been thinking about how to get you to California," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "The most direct route would take us through Carson City and over the Sierras, but Blackwell's bound to have men watching those roads." "What do you suggest?" Priscilla asked. "There's a trail that cuts north before turning west. It's longer but less traveled. We'd cross into California near Honey Lake, then head southwest. It would take us about 2 weeks, maybe more depending on the weather." Priscilla's heart sank. 2 weeks. "I can't ask you to give up that much time." "You're not asking," Dawson replied evenly. "I'm offering. Besides, I've been thinking about moving on anyway. The Wilson spread isn't what it used to be." "Why are you doing this?" Priscilla couldn't help but ask. "You could get killed helping me." Dawson was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Let's just say I've got my reasons for not liking men who hurt women." He rose abruptly, taking his plate to the wash basin. "We should leave soon. Blackwell's men will be back once they realize they've lost your trail." Priscilla wanted to ask more about his cryptic statement, but sensed he wouldn't welcome the questions. Instead, she helped him clean up after breakfast, then gathered her few belongings while he prepared for their journey. "Your dress is still damp," he noted as she folded it into her small bag. "You'd best keep wearing my clothes for now. They're better for riding anyway." He handed her a worn leather coat. "This will help disguise you too. From a distance, you'll look like a young man, not a woman on the run." The thought was oddly liberating. Priscilla had never worn men's clothing before last night, but she had to admit they were more practical for what lay ahead. Dawson had saddled both their horses and packed supplies for the journey. He handed Priscilla a wide-brimmed hat to complete her disguise. "Ready?" he asked, checking the cinch on his saddle one last time. Priscilla took a deep breath, looking back at the cabin that had sheltered her for the night. "Ready," she affirmed, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. They rode north initially, keeping to the tree line rather than open country. Dawson explained they would circle around before heading west, to further confuse any pursuers. He rode slightly ahead, alert for any sign of danger. As the morning wore on, Priscilla found herself studying her unexpected protector. Dawson Bailey sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and direct. There was a quiet strength about him that reassured her. Around midday, they stopped by a small stream to rest the horses. As Priscilla stretched her stiff muscles, Dawson scanned their back trail with a small spyglass. "See anything?" she asked, handing him a strip of dried beef from their provisions. "Nothing yet," he answered, pocketing the spyglass. But Blackwell isn't a man to give up easily, especially not when his pride is at stake. "It's more than pride," Priscilla said quietly. "It's about control. Charles can't stand the thought of losing anything he considers his property, and that's all I am to him, property." Dawson's expression hardened. "No person should be another's property," he said firmly. "Not ever." Something in his tone made Priscilla wonder again about his past. There was a depth of feeling in his words that spoke of personal experience. How did you end up married to a man like Blackwell?" Dawson asked after a moment, his curiosity evidently getting the better of him. Priscilla sighed, picking up a small stone and tossing it into the stream. "My father died when I was 17, leaving my mother and me with debts we couldn't pay. Charles offered to settle those debts in exchange for my hand. My mother didn't want me to accept, but I thought I was being practical." She gave a bitter laugh. "What a fool I was." "You were 18 and trying to save your mother," Dawson said gently. "That doesn't make you a fool." "I should have known what kind of man he was," Priscilla insisted. "There were signs from the beginning. The way he spoke about his first wife, how he tried to control every aspect of our courtship, but I ignored them." "We all miss things we should see," Dawson replied, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Doesn't mean we deserve what comes after." Before Priscilla could respond, Dawson suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on something behind her. She turned to see a plume of dust rising in the distance, moving in their direction. "Riders," Dawson said tersely. "Could be anyone, but we can't take chances. Time to move." They mounted quickly, pushing their horses to a faster pace as they moved deeper into the wooded hills. Priscilla's heart hammered in her chest, fear giving her a renewed surge of energy despite her already aching body. They rode hard for several hours, taking a winding route through increasingly rugged terrain. By late afternoon, they had climbed high enough that Priscilla could see for miles across the valley below. There was no sign of pursuit, but Dawson remained vigilant. "We'll make camp soon," he said as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. "There's a spot ahead that offers good cover and a clear view of the approach." The campsite he chose was a small clearing sheltered by a rocky outcropping. A trickle of a spring provided fresh water, and the rocks would reflect their small fire's heat while hiding its light from distant observers. As Dawson gathered wood for a fire, Priscilla took care of the horses, removing their saddles and rubbing them down. She had learned to care for horses at her father's small ranch and found comfort in the familiar task. "You handle horses well," Dawson observed as he returned with an armload of dry branches. "My father taught me," she replied with a small smile. "He raised quarter horses before he got sick. Not many, but good stock. Charles sold them all after we married. Said it wasn't proper for his wife to be mucking about in the stables." Dawson shook his head, his disapproval evident. "A woman who knows horses is worth twice one who doesn't," my mother always said. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Priscilla commented, curious to learn more about him. "She was," he replied, his expression softening with memory. "Taught me everything important I know. My father was a decent man, but it was my mother who had the real strength in our family." "Was?" Priscilla asked gently, noting his use of the past tense. Dawson nodded, concentrating on building the fire. "They both passed 5 years ago. Influenza took half our town, including my parents and my sister." "I'm sorry," Priscilla said, understanding the loss all too well. "It's hard to lose family." "It is," he agreed simply, "but we go on." As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, supplemented with jerky and dried apples. The night grew cold, and Priscilla pulled Dawson's coat tighter around her shoulders. "Tomorrow will be harder riding," Dawson warned as they sat by the small fire. "We need to cross that ridge before turning west." He pointed to a jagged line of hills barely visible in the moonlight. "I'll manage," Priscilla assured him, though her body already protested at the thought. She was used to riding, but not for such long stretches. Dawson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you will. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." His words warmed her more than the fire. No one had believed in her strength for a very long time. Charles had worked systematically to convince her of her weakness, her dependence on him. To have someone see strength in her was unexpected. "We should get some sleep," Dawson said, banking the fire. "I'll take first watch. I'll wake you in a few hours." Priscilla wanted to protest that she could take the first watch, but exhaustion was already pulling at her. She nodded, wrapping herself in the blanket he offered and lying down near the fire's warmth. As she drifted toward sleep, she watched Dawson through half-closed eyes. He sat with his back against a rock, rifle across his lap, his profile sharp against the night sky. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness she had never found in Charles despite all his wealth and power. For the second night in a row, Priscilla fell asleep feeling safer than she had in years. The next week passed in a blur of long days on horseback and nights spent under the stars. They traveled through rugged country, avoiding settlements and main trails. Dawson proved to be an experienced guide, finding paths Priscilla would never have noticed and securing food along the way with his hunting skills. They settled into a comfortable routine. During the day, they rode side by side when the trail permitted, talking occasionally about safe topics: the landscape, the weather, stories from Priscilla's childhood before her marriage. At night, they shared the watch duties, though Dawson always insisted on taking the longer shifts. On the 8th day of their journey, they crested a ridge to find a vast valley spread before them, the land rolling away to the west in gentle waves of gold and green. "California," Dawson announced, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "We'll cross the state line by nightfall." Priscilla felt a surge of emotion, relief mingled with apprehension. They had come so far, yet Charles's reach was long. Would crossing into another state be enough to escape him? "What will you do when we reach San Francisco?" Dawson asked as they began their descent into the valley. It was a question Priscilla had pondered during the long hours in the saddle. "Find work, I suppose," she answered. "I can sew well enough, or perhaps work as a shop girl." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. "The city offers opportunities, especially for someone with education." "I was fortunate in that regard," Priscilla acknowledged. "My father believed girls should be educated the same as boys. I had a tutor until I was 16. "That will serve you well," Dawson replied. He hesitated, then added, "There's something you should know. Even in California, you're still legally Blackwell's wife. He could claim you if he finds you." Priscilla's stomach clenched with fear. "I hadn't thought of that," she admitted. "Is there no way to be free of him?" "Divorce is difficult, especially when one party doesn't consent," Dawson said carefully. "But California has different laws than Nevada territory. You might find more sympathy there, especially if you can prove mistreatment." The thought of having to prove Charles's cruelty in a public courtroom made Priscilla shudder. She wasn't sure she had the courage for such an ordeal. "One step at a time," Dawson advised, seeming to sense her distress. "First, we get you safely to San Francisco. Then you can decide what comes next." They made camp that night just across the California border, in a grove of pines that offered good shelter. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Priscilla found herself studying Dawson's face in the flickering light. Over the past days, she had come to appreciate not just his help but his company. There was an honesty about him that was refreshing after years of Charles's manipulations. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After you've delivered me safely to San Francisco?" Dawson poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "Haven't decided yet," he admitted. "Might head north, try my luck in the logging camps, or south to the ranches near Los Angeles." "You don't have to rush off," Priscilla said before she could stop herself. "I mean, you might want to rest in the city for a while before moving on." Dawson looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "I suppose I could," he agreed slowly. Might be nice to sleep in a real bed for a change. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Priscilla was startled by how much she dreaded the thought of Dawson leaving once they reached their destination. In such a short time, he had become more than a guide or protector. He had become a friend, perhaps the only true friend she had. The moment was broken by a distant sound that made them both tense. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace. Dawson immediately doused the fire, plunging them into darkness. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing his rifle. "I'll see who it is." Priscilla's heart raced as she watched Dawson disappear into the trees. She pulled her own pistol, a small Derringer Dawson had given her on their third day, from her pocket, clutching it tightly. Minutes stretched endlessly until Dawson returned, his expression grim. "6 riders," he reported quietly. "Moving slow, checking the terrain. They're searching for someone." "Charles's men," Priscilla whispered, fear constricting her throat. Dawson nodded. "Likely. They're about a mile east, moving in this direction. We need to go. Now." They packed quickly, working in the darkness with practiced efficiency born of their days on the trail together. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving deeper into the California wilderness, leaving no trace of their camp behind. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as hard as they dared in the darkness. Dawson led them on a twisting route, crossing streams multiple times to break their trail. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers, but both riders and horses were exhausted. "We need to rest," Dawson said as they emerged from a dense thicket into a small meadow. "The horses can't go on without food and water." They dismounted in a sheltered spot near a small creek. While the horses drank and grazed, Dawson and Priscilla ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack. "How did they find us?" Priscilla asked, her voice hoarse with fatigue. "We've been so careful." "Blackwell must have men searching every possible route to California," Dawson reasoned. "We were bound to cross paths with some of them eventually." "What do we do now?" Dawson studied their surroundings, his expression thoughtful. "We change our plans. Head southwest instead of due west. There's a town called Placerville about 3 days' ride from here. We can resupply there and find out if Blackwell's men are still on our trail." The detour would add days to their journey, but Priscilla nodded in agreement. Better to be cautious than captured. They rested for a few hours before setting off again, now heading in a new direction. The terrain grew increasingly mountainous, with steep climbs that tested both horses and riders. By nightfall, they had reached a high plateau offering a commanding view of the valleys below. "We'll sleep in shifts again tonight," Dawson said as they made camp. 4 hours each. Priscilla agreed, though she knew she would struggle to sleep. The close call with Charles's men had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. As she took the first watch, sitting with her back against a boulder and Dawson's rifle across her lap, she found herself fighting back tears of frustration and fear. She had come so far, risked so much, and still, Charles pursued her like a hunter after wounded prey. Would she ever truly be free of him? The sound of Dawson stirring pulled her from her dark thoughts. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Not your shift yet," she said softly. "Can't sleep," he replied, moving to sit beside her. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the moonlight cast silver shadows across the landscape below. "I was engaged once," Dawson said suddenly, his voice quiet in the night. "To a woman named Sarah. Her father didn't approve of me, thought she could do better than a cowhand. When she refused to break it off, he married her to a businessman from Sacramento instead." Priscilla turned to look at him, surprised by the personal revelation. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Dawson shrugged, his eyes on the distant horizon. "It was a long time ago." But I heard later that he mistreated her, much like Blackwell mistreated you. She died in childbirth 3 years after they wed." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I've always wondered if I could have prevented it somehow, if I'd fought harder to keep her." Understanding dawned on Priscilla. "That's why you're helping me," she said softly. "Because you couldn't help her." "Partly," Dawson admitted, "but also because it's the right thing to do. No one deserves to live in fear, especially not from someone who promised to cherish them." Impulsively, Priscilla reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for helping me escape, but for seeing me the real me, not just Charles Blackwell's wife." Dawson's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a connection deeper than their shared journey. For a breathless moment, Priscilla thought he might lean closer, but instead he gently covered her hand with his own. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "I'll keep watch now." As Priscilla settled into her blanket, she was acutely aware of Dawson's presence nearby, solid, reassuring, and increasingly dear to her. The realization both comforted and frightened her. She was still a married woman, still hunted, still vulnerable. Feelings for Dawson Bailey, however natural they might seem, could only complicate an already dangerous situation. Yet as sleep claimed her, it was his face she saw behind her closed eyelids, not the nightmare visage of Charles Blackwell that had haunted her for so long. The next 2 days passed without sign of pursuit, though neither Priscilla nor Dawson relaxed their vigilance. They traveled through increasingly populated areas, passing occasional farms and logging camps, which meant they had to be more careful about being seen. Priscilla continued to wear men's clothing, with her hair tucked up under Dawson's spare hat. From a distance, she could pass for a young man traveling with a companion. Up close, the disguise wouldn't hold, but it gave them an advantage when observed from afar. Late in the afternoon of their 3rd day after the near encounter with Charles's men, they spotted Placerville nestled in a valley ahead. The sight of a proper town after so many days in the wilderness brought mixed emotions. On one hand, Priscilla longed for a real bed and a hot bath. On the other, towns meant people, and people meant potential recognition. "We'll approach after dark," Dawson decided, studying the settlement from their vantage point. "Less chance of being noticed that way. I know an innkeeper there who doesn't ask too many questions." They waited until dusk deepened into true darkness before making their way down to the town. Placerville had grown from a gold rush camp into a proper settlement, with wooden buildings lining the main street and the sounds of a saloon piano drifting through the night air. Dawson led them to a small inn at the edge of town, away from the busier establishments. The building was weathered but well-maintained, with a simple sign reading "Miner's Rest" hanging above the door. "Wait here," Dawson instructed, dismounting. "Let me make sure it's safe." Priscilla remained on her horse, watching as Dawson entered the inn. The minutes stretched anxiously until he reappeared at the door, gesturing for her to join him. Inside, a gray-haired man with a friendly face greeted them. "Any friend of Dawson's is welcome here," he said, offering Priscilla a warm smile. "I'm Tom Jenkins. This is Pat," Dawson introduced her, using the alias they had agreed upon. "We need a room for the night and some information if you have it." Tom nodded, his eyes betraying no curiosity about Priscilla's male attire or their arrival at such a late hour. "Got a nice room at the back. Quiet, with its own entrance. And information is something I usually have plenty of." He led them through the inn to a small room that was simple but clean, with a double bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking a small garden. "I'll send up some hot water and food," Tom said, handing Dawson a key. "Then we can talk." When he had gone, Priscilla sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden return to civilization after their days in the wilderness. "He seems trustworthy," she observed, removing her hat and letting her hair fall free. "Tom's good people," Dawson confirmed. "Helped me out of a tight spot a few years back. He won't betray us." A knock at the door announced a young woman with a tray of food and a pitcher of hot water. She set them down with a quick curtsy and departed without a word, her eyes carefully averted from Priscilla. The meal was simple stew, bread and coffee, but to Priscilla, it seemed like a feast after days of trail rations. She ate eagerly, savoring the taste of fresh bread and hot food. "I'll go talk to Tom while you wash up," Dawson said when they had finished eating. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." Alone in the room, Priscilla gratefully used the hot water to wash away days of trail dust. She changed into her dress, which was wrinkled but clean thanks to a washing in a stream several days earlier. The familiar garment felt strange after so many days in men's clothing, more restrictive, more formal, a reminder of the life she had fled. Dawson returned as she was combing out her damp hair. He paused in the doorway, his expression shifting as he took in the sight of her in the dress. "You look," he began, then seemed to think better of whatever he had been about to say. "Did the water help?" "Immensely," she replied, self-conscious under his gaze. "What did Tom say?" "Any news of Charles's men?" Dawson closed the door and moved to the window, checking that the curtains were fully drawn before speaking. "3 men matching the description of Blackwell's hands passed through town yesterday," he reported grimly. "They were asking questions, showing a sketch of you." Priscilla's heart sank. "They're still looking." "And they're ahead of us now," Dawson added. They were headed toward Sacramento, which is on our route to San Francisco. "What do we do?" she asked, fear threatening to overwhelm her again. Dawson ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "We need to change our destination, at least temporarily. Tom suggested we head to Stockton instead. It's south of Sacramento, but still a good-sized city where you could disappear while we figure out our next move." "Stockton," Priscilla repeated, trying to recall what she knew of California geography. "How far is it?" "About 5 days' ride from here, if we're careful," Dawson answered. "Tom's arranging fresh supplies for us, and we'll leave before dawn." Priscilla nodded, accepting the change of plans. She had put her fate in Dawson's hands, and so far he had kept her safe. If he thought Stockton was their best option, she would trust his judgment. "There's only one bed," she observed, the realization suddenly dawning on her. Their nights on the trail had always been spent with a respectful distance between their bedrolls. "I'll sleep on the floor," Dawson said immediately, not meeting her eyes. "No," Priscilla protested. "You need proper rest as much as I do. The bed is large enough for both of us." She felt her cheeks warm at her own boldness but pressed on. "We can maintain propriety with a blanket between us." Dawson looked uncertain, but fatigue won out over decorum. "If you're sure," he conceded. They arranged the bed awkwardly, creating a barrier of blankets down the middle. Priscilla lay stiffly on her side, acutely aware of Dawson's presence beside her despite the improvised divide. The soft sound of his breathing gradually slowed as he fell asleep. But Priscilla remained awake, her mind racing with thoughts of their journey, of Charles's relentless pursuit, and increasingly, of the man lying beside her. In the weeks since her escape, Dawson Bailey had become more than a guide or protector. He had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. His quiet strength, his unwavering respect for her, his belief in her right to freedom all had awakened feelings she had thought Charles had permanently crushed. But what place did such feelings have in her current circumstances? She was still legally bound to Charles, still hunted, still uncertain of her future. And Dawson, Dawson had his own life, his own plans that didn't include an on-the-run woman with a dangerous husband. These thoughts chased themselves through Priscilla's mind until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. They left Placerville in the gray light before dawn, their horses refreshed, and their supplies replenished thanks to Tom's assistance. The innkeeper had provided them with a more detailed map of the region and information about the safest routes to Stockton. Avoid the main roads, he had advised. Blackwell's men will be watching them. The old mining trails are harder going, but you're less likely to be seen. For the next 3 days, they followed his advice, traveling through rugged country that had once been the heart of gold rush territory. Abandoned mines and the skeletal remains of mining camps dotted the landscape, silent reminders of fortunes made and lost. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as they picked their way along a narrow trail high in the foothills, Dawson suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop. Priscilla reined in her horse, instantly alert. "What is it?" she whispered, scanning the trail ahead. "Not sure," Dawson replied, his voice equally low. "Thought I saw movement up ahead." They sat motionless, listening intently. The forest around them seemed unusually quiet, the normal sounds of birds and small animals conspicuously absent. "Something's not right," Dawson muttered. He reached for his rifle, slowly pulling it from its scabbard. Before he could bring the weapon to bear, a voice called out from the trees to their right. "That's far enough. Hands where we can see them." 3 men emerged from the forest, rifles aimed at Dawson and Priscilla. They wore rough clothes, their faces weathered and hard. Not Charles's men, Priscilla realized with relief, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. "We don't want trouble," Dawson said evenly, keeping his hands visible but not raising them fully. "Just passing through." "Passing through with some mighty fine horses and gear," one of the men observed, his eyes moving covetously over their mounts and supplies. "Might be you could share some of that bounty." "Bandits, then." The realization sent a chill through Priscilla. Highway robbery was common in these remote regions, where law enforcement was sparse and travelers vulnerable. "We don't have much," Dawson replied, his tone still calm though Priscilla could see the tension in his shoulders. "Some food, a little money. Take it and let us be on our way." The leader of the trio, a tall man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, laughed harshly. "Oh, we'll take it all right. The horses, too." His gaze shifted to Priscilla, and his smile turned ugly. "And maybe a bit more besides. Been a while since we had such pretty company." Priscilla felt sick, her hand instinctively moving toward her hidden derringer. Dawson shifted slightly, positioning his horse to partially block her from the men's view. "The lady's not part of any deal," he said, his voice hardening. "You want our supplies, fine, but then you let us both go." The scarred man's expression darkened. "You're not in a position to be making demands, Cowboy." "Neither are you," came a new voice from behind them. Priscilla turned to see 2 mounted men emerge from the trees to their rear, rifles trained on the bandits. They wore the distinctive attire of law enforcement, not full uniforms, but badges clearly visible on their vests. "Drop those weapons," one of the lawmen ordered, "unless you boys want to add resisting arrest to your charges." For a tense moment, Priscilla thought the bandits might fight, but self-preservation won out. They lowered their rifles, faces sullen with thwarted plans. "You folks all right?" the second lawman asked, approaching Dawson and Priscilla while his partner secured the bandits. "We're fine," Dawson answered, though his hand still rested near his gun. "Fortunate timing on your part. Been tracking these 3 for a week," the lawman explained. "They've robbed half a dozen travelers in these parts, nasty pieces of work." He studied them curiously. "You're a bit off the usual routes. Mind if I ask where you're headed?" Priscilla tensed, but Dawson answered smoothly. Stockton, taking the back trails to avoid the crowds on the main roads. The lawman nodded, apparently accepting the explanation. Well, you'll want to be extra careful from here on. There's been reports of other troublemakers in the area. We appreciate the warning, Dawson replied, and the timely rescue. After the lawmen had departed with their prisoners, Dawson and Priscilla continued along the trail, both shaken by the encounter. That was too close, Priscilla said when they had put some distance between themselves and the scene of the confrontation. If those lawmen hadn't come along. But they did, Dawson reminded her gently. No use dwelling on what might have happened. Priscilla nodded, though the incident had left her badly rattled. The constant vigilance, the ever-present danger, it was wearing on her more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. They made camp that night in a well-concealed hollow, building only the smallest of fires for fear of attracting more unwanted attention. As they sat close together for warmth, Priscilla found herself overwhelmed by the events of the past weeks. Will it ever end? She asked quietly. This running, this fear? Dawson looked at her across the small flames, his face serious in the flickering light. Yes, he said with conviction. It will end. Blackwell can't search forever. Eventually, he'll have to return to his business, his life. And by then, you'll be established somewhere new, somewhere safe. You make it sound so certain, Priscilla said, wishing she could share his confidence. Nothing in life is certain, Dawson admitted, but I believe in taking control of your own destiny. You've already shown more courage than most by leaving him. That same courage will see you through whatever comes next. His faith in her touched Priscilla deeply. No one had ever believed in her the way Dawson seemed to. Not her mother, who had always encouraged compliance and acceptance of one's lot in life. Certainly not Charles, who had methodically undermined her confidence at every turn. What about you? She asked softly. What does your destiny hold, Dawson Bailey? He was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. I don't know, he finally answered honestly. For years I've been drifting from job to job, place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Because of Sarah. Priscilla ventured, remembering his story about his lost love. Partly, he acknowledged. But also because I never found anywhere that felt right, nowhere that felt like home. The word home hung between them, laden with meaning. Priscilla realized with a pang that she had never truly had a home, not her father's struggling ranch, not Charles's grand house where she had been more prisoner than mistress. Home, she was beginning to understand, wasn't a place at all, but a feeling of belonging, of safety, of being truly seen and accepted. And somehow, despite all odds, she had begun to find that feeling with Dawson. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. What right did she have to such feelings? She was still a married woman, still hunted, still uncertain of her future. And yet, sitting beside him in the wilderness, she felt more at peace than she had in years. Thank you, she said suddenly. The words insufficient for what she wanted to express, but all she could manage. Dawson looked up, surprised. For what? For everything, Priscilla replied simply. For helping me when you had no obligation to do so. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For making me feel. She hesitated, searching for the right word. Safe, she finished, though it wasn't exactly what she meant. Something flickered in Dawson's eyes, a warmth, a tenderness that made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might reach for her, might bridge the small physical distance between them that suddenly seemed both vast and insignificant. Instead, he nodded, a small smile touching his lips. You're welcome, he said softly. Though the truth is, I think you've helped me as much as I've helped you. How so? Priscilla asked, genuinely puzzled. By reminding me that there are things worth fighting for, Dawson answered. Worth taking risks for. I'd forgotten that, I think. His words warmed her more than the fire, creating a glow inside her chest that spread outward, chasing away the chill of fear and uncertainty. For the first time since fleeing Charles, Priscilla allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future that might include happiness, purpose, and perhaps even love. They reached Stockton late in the afternoon, 2 days later. The city was bustling with activity, its streets filled with wagons, horses, and pedestrians going about their business. After weeks in the wilderness, the noise and crowds were overwhelming to Priscilla. "Stay close," Dawson advised as they rode through the outskirts, heading for the less populated districts where they might find lodging without attracting too much attention. They found a small hotel on a quiet side street, the kind of establishment that catered to travelers who valued privacy over luxury. The proprietress, a plump woman named Mrs. Wilson, gave them a room on the second floor with a view of the back alley, rather than the street, exactly what they needed. "I'll need to find work," Priscilla said as they settled into their room. She had changed back into her dress, feeling it was safer to appear as a respectable woman now that they were in a city. "My money won't last forever." "We should wait a few days before you venture out too much," Dawson cautioned. "Make sure Blackwell's men haven't tracked us here." Priscilla nodded, accepting the wisdom of his advice even as she chafed at the continued confinement. She longed to walk freely, to breathe the air of independence that had been her goal when fleeing Charles's ranch. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you look for work here?" Dawson hesitated. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "I suppose I should." The unspoken question hung between them. How long would Dawson stay now that he had delivered her safely to a city? His promise had been to see her to California, a promise now fulfilled. Yet the thought of him leaving made Priscilla's chest ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. The next few days established a cautious routine. Dawson would go out in the mornings to gather information, checking for any sign that Charles's men had followed them to Stockton. Priscilla remained in the room, venturing out only in Dawson's company and always with her hair tucked up under a bonnet to change her appearance. On their 4th day in the city, Dawson returned from his morning reconnaissance with a newspaper in hand, his expression grim. "What is it?" Priscilla asked, alarmed by his demeanor. Dawson handed her the paper, pointing to a small article on the 3rd page. It was a notice, offering a substantial reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Priscilla Blackwell, described as having run away from her husband's home in Nevada territory. "He's not giving up," Priscilla whispered, her hands trembling as she read the cold, formal language that reduced her escape to a matter of property retrieval. "The reward will bring out bounty hunters," Dawson said grimly. "Men who make their living finding people who don't want to be found." Fear, which had begun to recede during their days in Stockton, came rushing back. "What do we do?" Priscilla asked, hating the quaver in her voice. Dawson paced the small room, thinking. "We need legal protection," he said finally. "A divorce would be ideal, but that takes time and might require you to return to Nevada, which is too dangerous." "There must be another way," Priscilla insisted. "There might be," Dawson agreed slowly. "I need to make some inquiries. Will you be all right here for a few hours?" Priscilla nodded, though the thought of being alone made her nervous. "I'll be fine. Just be careful." After Dawson left, Priscilla tried to occupy herself with mending some of their trail-worn clothing, but her mind kept returning to the newspaper notice. The reward Charles offered was substantial enough to tempt many in a frontier town where money was often scarce. How long before someone recognized her, despite her precautions? When Dawson finally returned late in the afternoon, His expression was cautiously optimistic. "I spoke with a lawyer," he announced. "Fellow named Jenkins who specializes in family matters. He says there might be a way forward that doesn't involve returning to Nevada." "What is it?" Priscilla asked eagerly. "California has different laws regarding married women," Dawson explained. "More progressive than most territories. Under certain circumstances, a woman can petition for a divorce based on cruelty or abandonment without her husband's presence or consent." Hope flared in Priscilla's chest. "Could I qualify for that?" "Jenkins thinks so, especially if we can find witnesses to corroborate your account of Blackwell's behavior." Dawson hesitated. "But there's a catch. The process takes time, months potentially, and during that time you'd still legally be Blackwell's wife, still vulnerable if he finds you." "So we're back where we started," Priscilla said, disappointment crushing her momentary optimism. "Not exactly," Dawson replied, a strange note entering his voice. "Jenkins suggested another possibility, one that might offer more immediate protection." "What is it?" Priscilla asked, noticing the unusual hesitancy in Dawson's manner. Dawson took a deep breath as if steeling himself. "Remarriage," he said simply. Priscilla stared at him, not comprehending. "But I'm already married." "How could I? California doesn't recognize marriages performed under duress," Dawson explained. "If you were to marry again, claiming your first marriage was forced, it could create a legal complication that would make it harder for Blackwell to claim you. It would buy time for the divorce proceedings to progress." "Marry again," Priscilla repeated slowly, the implication sinking in. "But who would?" She stopped as understanding dawned, her eyes widening as she looked at Dawson. "It would be a marriage of convenience only," he hastened to add, his cheeks coloring slightly. "A legal protection, nothing more. Once the divorce is finalized, we could go our separate ways if that's what you wanted." The proposal for "that's what it was," however practical its framing, left Priscilla speechless. Marriage to Dawson Bailey. The thought sent a rush of conflicting emotions through her: surprise, confusion, and something else she wasn't ready to name. "You would do that?" she finally managed to ask. "Tie yourself to my troubles, my legal battles. I'm already tied to them," Dawson pointed out with a small smile. "Have been since that night you showed up at my cabin in the rain." Priscilla stood and moved to the window, needing space to think. The idea was radical, perhaps even scandalous, but she couldn't deny its practical merits. As Dawson's wife, she would have his legal protection, his name as a shield against Charles's claims. But it wasn't just the practicality that made her heart race. The thought of being bound to Dawson, even in a marriage of convenience, stirred feelings she had been trying to ignore since their journey began. "You don't have to decide now," Dawson said gently, misinterpreting her silence. "It's just an option to consider." Priscilla turned to face him, studying the man who had risked so much for her already and was now offering to risk even more. In his eyes, she saw not calculation or desire, but simple concern for her welfare and perhaps something deeper, something he was trying as hard as she was to keep hidden. "When would we do this?" she asked, her decision already forming, though she hadn't yet acknowledged it even to herself. Surprise flickered across Dawson's face, followed quickly by relief. "Jenkins said he could arrange it quickly. Tomorrow if we wanted." "Tomorrow," Priscilla repeated. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and uncertainty. "Are you sure?" Dawson asked quietly. "It's a big step, even if it is just a legal arrangement." Priscilla considered his question carefully. Was she sure? No, not entirely. But she was sure of one thing. She trusted Dawson Bailey more than she had trusted anyone in years. And right now, trust seemed like the most important foundation for any decision. "I'm sure," she affirmed, her voice stronger than she expected. If you're willing to do this, then I accept your proposal. The word proposal brought a hint of color to Dawson's cheeks again, but he nodded, his expression serious. I'll speak with Jenkins first thing in the morning to make the arrangements. That night, as they prepared for sleep in their now familiar arrangement, Dawson on a pallet on the floor, Priscilla in the bed, an awkward awareness hung between them. Tomorrow, they would be husband and wife, if only on paper. The thought kept Priscilla awake long after Dawson's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. Was she making another mistake, rushing into another marriage? But no, this was different. Dawson wasn't Charles. He had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. This marriage was a shield, not a trap. And when the time came, if she chose to walk away, she believed he would honor that choice. With that reassurance, Priscilla finally drifted into sleep, dreaming not of pursuit or fear, but of a future where she might truly be free. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling within Priscilla. She dressed with care in her one good dress, which Dawson had sent to be cleaned and pressed the day before. "Ready?" Dawson asked when she emerged from behind the dressing screen. He looked different today, having visited the barber and traded his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and vest that must have been newly purchased. "As ready as I'll ever be," Priscilla replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Despite her rational understanding of their arrangement, her stomach fluttered with nerves. Jenkins, the lawyer, met them at his office as arranged. He was a small, precise man with spectacles that magnified his shrewd eyes. After reviewing their situation once more and ensuring they understood the legal implications, he escorted them to the local magistrate's office. The ceremony itself was brief and perfunctory. No flowers, no music, no witnesses beyond Jenkins and the magistrate's clerk. Priscilla spoke her vows in a clear voice, conscious of the irony that these words spoken now without love, but with full consent, meant more than the same promises she had made to Charles under the weight of familial expectation and financial necessity. When Dawson slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another of his morning errands, she realized the metal felt warm against her skin. His hand lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up, she found his eyes on her face, his expression unreadable. "By the authority vested in me by the state of California, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the magistrate declared, closing his book with an air of finality. "You may kiss the bride." Priscilla hadn't considered this part of the ceremony. From Dawson's momentary hesitation, neither had he. But after a brief pause, he leaned forward and placed the gentlest of kisses on her lips, a mere brushing of contact that nonetheless sent a surprising warmth through her body. It was done. She was now, legally, Mrs. Dawson Bailey. Outside the magistrate's office, Jenkins shook their hands, his manner businesslike. "I'll begin the divorce proceedings against Blackwell immediately," he assured them. "With luck, we can have the matter resolved within 6 months. In the meantime, Mrs. Bailey is legally under your protection, Mr. Bailey. I suggest you both maintain a low profile until the situation is resolved." After the lawyer departed, Priscilla and Dawson stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, neither quite sure how to proceed with their new status. "Are you hungry?" Dawson finally asked, breaking the silence. "We could get some lunch to, celebrate." Priscilla smiled at his attempt at normalcy. "Lunch would be nice," she agreed. They found a small cafe near the waterfront where they could sit at an outside table and watch the boats on the channel. The simple act of sharing a meal in public, without fear of immediate discovery, felt like a luxury after weeks of hiding and running. "What happens now?" Priscilla asked as they lingered over coffee, the question encompassing far more than just their immediate plans. "Jenkins recommended we leave Stockton," Dawson replied. "Too many people might have seen that reward notice. He suggested we consider moving north, perhaps to one of the smaller towns in the Sacramento Valley where Blackwell's influence is less likely to reach." Priscilla nodded, accepting the continued need for caution. "And after that, after the divorce is final," Dawson studied his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "That would be your decision," he said quietly. "As we agreed, our arrangement is temporary. When you're legally free of Blackwell, you can choose whatever future you want." "And what about you?" Priscilla pressed, needing to understand his expectations. "What do you want after all this is over?" Dawson was silent for a long moment. When he finally looked up, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that caught at Priscilla's heart. "I want you to be safe and happy," he said simply. "Beyond that," he hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Beyond that, I've come to care for you, Priscilla. More than I should, perhaps, given our circumstances, but I won't hold you to anything. When the time comes, the choice will be yours." His honesty, his willingness to lay his feelings bare while still respecting her autonomy, touched Priscilla deeply. No man had ever spoken to her that way, as an equal, with the right to determine her own path. "I care for you too," she admitted softly, the words coming easier than she had expected. "These past weeks, despite all the danger and fear, they've also been the first time in years I've felt truly alive, truly myself, and that's largely because of you." A smile slowly spread across Dawson's face, transforming his serious expression into something that made Priscilla's heart skip. He reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb gently tracing the gold band he had placed there hours earlier. "Then perhaps," he suggested carefully, "we could see where this leads us. No promises, no expectations, just possibility." "Possibility," Priscilla repeated, liking the sound of the word. After years of confinement and certainty in her marriage to Charles, possibility felt like the most precious gift imaginable. They left Stockton the next day, heading north as Jenkins had suggested. Dawson had connections in a small farming community called Fairhaven in the Sacramento Valley, where he thought they might find both work and the anonymity they needed, while waiting for the divorce to be finalized. The journey was far less fraught than their earlier travels, with no sign of pursuit. They took their time, stopping when they pleased, no longer driven by urgent fear. In this more relaxed atmosphere, they began to truly know each other, sharing stories and dreams that had seemed too personal during their flight from Charles. Priscilla learned that Dawson had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, the son of a hard-working couple who had taught him the value of honesty and self-reliance. He had left home at 18, driven by a restless spirit and a desire to see more of the world than his corner of Texas offered. In turn, she told him about her childhood on her father's struggling ranch, about her love of books and learning, and about the dreams she had abandoned when she married Charles, dreams of perhaps becoming a teacher or running her own small business. "You could still do those things," Dawson encouraged her. "Once the divorce is final, you'll be free to pursue whatever you want." The idea was both exhilarating and frightening. After years of having her choices made for her, the prospect of such freedom was almost overwhelming. They arrived in Fairhaven a week after leaving Stockton. It was a small but thriving community centered around farming and the local sawmill. Dawson's connection, an old friend named Robert who ran the general store, welcomed them warmly and helped them find a small house to rent on the outskirts of town. "It's not much," Dawson apologized as they stood in the main room of the cabin, which consisted of a combined kitchen and living area with a single bedroom partitioned off at the back. but it's clean and solid. It's perfect, Priscilla assured him, already seeing the potential in the simple space. It was the first home that would be truly hers, or rather, theirs, and that made it beautiful despite its humble nature. The question of sleeping arrangements arose that first night, as it had been bound to do. The cabin had only one bed, and while they had shared a room at the hotel in Stockton, they had maintained their separate sleeping spaces. "I can make a pallet in here," Dawson offered, gesturing to the main room. "You take the bedroom." Priscilla hesitated. Their marriage might have begun as a legal arrangement, but their feelings for each other had grown increasingly clear during their journey to Fairhaven. The careful distance they had maintained was beginning to feel more like an artificial barrier than a necessary protection. "Or," she suggested, her voice steadier than she felt, "we could share the bed as a real husband and wife might." Dawson's eyes widened slightly, but he made no move toward her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle. "There's no rush, Priscilla, no expectations." "I'm sure," she replied, and she was. Whatever happened between them now would be her choice, freely given, not taken or coerced. "I trust you, Dawson, more than I've ever trusted anyone." That night they lay side by side in the darkness, the space between them small yet significant. Dawson reached out slowly to take her hand, the simple contact feeling more intimate than any touch she had experienced before. "Good night, Mrs. Bailey," he whispered, a smile in his voice. "Good night, Mr. Bailey," she replied, squeezing his hand gently as she closed her eyes. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Dawson found work at the sawmill, while Priscilla began helping at the general store, utilizing her education to assist with the books and correspondence. They became part of the community, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as no word of Charles or his men reached their peaceful haven. Their life together evolved naturally, without pressure or haste. The initial awkwardness of their arrangement gave way to a comfortable partnership during the day and an increasingly tender intimacy at night. Dawson never pushed, always letting Priscilla set the pace of their physical relationship, his patience and consideration healing wounds Charles had inflicted on her spirit. 3 months after their arrival in Fairhaven, a letter arrived from Jenkins. The divorce proceedings were progressing well, he reported. He had collected testimonies from several former employees of Blackwell Ranch who were willing to corroborate Priscilla's claims of cruelty and mistreatment. The lawyer was optimistic that the divorce would be granted within another 3 months. "It's really happening," Priscilla said wonderingly as she reread the letter. They were sitting on the small porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. "I'm going to be free of him." Dawson, seated beside her, took her hand in his. "You've been free of him since the night you rode away," he said softly. "The law is just catching up to what you already claimed for yourself." Priscilla smiled at his perspective. "I suppose you're right," she agreed. "But it will be nice to have it officially recognized." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the evening sounds of crickets and distant cattle. Priscilla found herself thinking about their future with a clarity she hadn't allowed herself before. The divorce would mean the end of their legal need for marriage, but the thought of parting from Dawson now seemed impossible to contemplate. "What are you thinking?" Dawson asked, noticing her pensive expression. "I'm thinking about us," she answered honestly. "About what happens after the divorce is final." Dawson's hand tightened slightly on hers. "And what are your thoughts on that subject?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though she could sense the tension beneath his calm exterior. Priscilla turned to face him fully, her decision made with a certainty that felt right and true. "I'm thinking that I don't want a divorce from you, Dawson Bailey. I'm thinking that what began as an arrangement has become something much more real and precious to me." The hope that bloomed in Dawson's eyes made her heart swell. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "I'm saying that I love you," Priscilla stated simply. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to remain your wife. Not because I need your protection anymore, but because I want to build a life with you." Dawson's response was immediate and heartfelt. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the feeling that words could not adequately express. When they finally broke apart, his eyes shone with a joy that matched the warmth in Priscilla's own heart. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Have since that night in the cabin when you stood there dripping rain on my floor, looking like a half-drowned kitten with more courage than sense." Priscilla laughed, remembering how terrified she had been that night, how desperate and alone. "You saved me," she said softly. Dawson shook his head, his expression serious. "No, you saved yourself. You had the courage to leave, to ride out into that storm not knowing what you'd find. I just happened to be the lucky fool who opened his door." "Well, I'm glad it was your door," Priscilla replied, leaning against his shoulder as they turned their attention back to the fading sunset. "Of all the doors in Nevada territory, I found the right one." Their peaceful existence in Fairhaven continued through the summer and into the early fall. The small house became a true home, filled with the simple comforts they both valued and the growing love between them. Priscilla planted a garden, Dawson built furniture for their home in his spare time, and together they created a life neither had dared hope for during those desperate days of flight. In late September, another letter arrived from Jenkins. The divorce had been granted. Charles Blackwell had contested it initially, but had eventually withdrawn his objection when faced with the testimonies against him. Priscilla was legally free. They celebrated that night with a special dinner and a bottle of wine Robert had given them for the occasion. As they sat at their small table, glasses raised in a toast to her freedom, Priscilla felt the last weight lift from her shoulders. "To new beginnings," Dawson proposed, his eyes warm with love as he gazed at her across the table. "To new beginnings," Priscilla echoed, touching her glass to his. "And to the man who said, 'They'll never catch you now,' on a stormy night when I needed to hear those words more than anything." Dawson smiled at the memory. "I meant it then, and it proved true. They never did catch you. Because of you," Priscilla insisted. "Because you helped me when you had no reason to, protected me when it put you at risk, and loved me when I was still learning how to love myself again." "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done," Dawson replied simply, "and the most rewarding." Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Priscilla nestled against Dawson's side, his arm a comforting weight around her shoulders. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, pattering on the roof in a soothing rhythm that reminded her of that first night, the night she had fled into the storm, and found, against all odds, not just safety but the promise of happiness. "I was thinking," Dawson said into the comfortable silence, his voice soft but thoughtful. "Now that everything's official, maybe we should consider a real wedding. Not the quick ceremony we had in Stockton, but something with friends and celebration. A proper beginning." Priscilla raised herself on one elbow to look at him, touched by the suggestion. "I'd like that," she agreed. "A chance to make vows we choose freely, not out of necessity but out of love." Dawson smiled, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "And after that," he continued, a hint of nervousness entering his voice, "I was wondering how you might feel about starting a family. Not right away if you're not ready, but someday." The question caught Priscilla by surprise, not because she hadn't thought about it, but because it represented a future so far removed from the terror of her life with Charles that it seemed almost like a dream. Children of her own, raised with love and gentleness, in a home where fear had no place. "I'd like that too," she said softly, her heart full. "Very much." The joy that spread across Dawson's face told her everything she needed to know about his feelings on the matter. He pulled her down for a kiss that spoke of promises and dreams and a future built together. Spring arrived in Fairhaven with an explosion of wildflowers and new beginnings. The small white church at the center of town was decorated with early blossoms for the occasion that had brought the entire community together, the wedding of Dawson and Priscilla Bailey. Although legally they had been married for months, this ceremony held a different meaning. It was a celebration, a public declaration of a love that had begun in desperate circumstances, but had grown strong and sure in the safety of their new home. Priscilla wore a dress of pale blue silk, a gift from the women of Fairhaven who had taken her into their circle with warmth and acceptance. Her dark hair was adorned with a crown of white flowers, and in her hands she carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadow near their home. As she walked down the aisle toward Dawson, Priscilla's mind briefly flashed back to that rainy night almost a year ago, the fear, the desperate flight, the uncertainty. How far they had come from that moment, how much had changed. Dawson waited for her at the altar, his expression one of undisguised adoration as she approached. He wore a new suit for the occasion, his usually wind-blown hair tamed for the day, but his eyes were the same clear and honest, reflecting a love that still took her breath away. They spoke their vows with clear voices and full hearts, promises freely given and joyfully received. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife again, but this time with the blessing of friends and community, the kiss they shared was a testament to the journey that had brought them to this moment. The celebration afterward was filled with music, laughter, and the kind of simple abundance that comes from many hands working together. Tables groaned with food prepared by the women of the town, while the men had constructed a dance floor in the churchyard where couples now twirled to the lively tunes of a local fiddler. "Happy, Mrs. Bailey?" Dawson asked as they took a moment's respite from the dancing, his arm around her waist as they watched their friends and neighbors enjoy the festivities. "Completely," Priscilla affirmed, leaning into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible," and it was true. The shadows of her past with Charles still existed. Such wounds didn't vanish overnight, but they had faded significantly in the light of her new life with Dawson. She had found not just safety but joy, not just escape but purpose. As the celebration continued around them, Priscilla placed her hand over her still flat stomach, a secret smile playing at her lips. She hadn't told Dawson yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that would change their lives once again. But she was sure now. By the time winter returned to Fairhaven, their family would grow by one. Later that night, as they walked hand in hand back to their home under a canopy of stars, Priscilla decided it was time to share her secret. "I have something to tell you," she said, stopping in the moonlit path before their door. Dawson turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Priscilla announced, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "In about 7 months, if the doctor's estimation is correct." For a moment, Dawson stood perfectly still, as if processing her words. Then his face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it brought tears to Priscilla's eyes. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "We're going to be parents." He placed his hand gently over hers where it rested on her stomach. "Are you happy about this?" "Very," Priscilla assured him. "Nervous, of course, but mostly happy. This child will have what I did in a home filled with love, with parents who respect each other." Dawson gathered her into his arms, his embrace gentle as if she had suddenly become fragile with her announcement. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." 6 months later, as the first snow of winter dusted the Fairhaven Valley, Robert Bailey made his arrival in the world, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and a lusty cry that announced his presence to all within hearing distance. Priscilla, exhausted but radiant after a relatively easy labor, watched as Dawson held their son for the first time, his strong hands careful and tender with the tiny bundle. "He's perfect," Dawson whispered, awe in his voice as he gazed down at the infant. "Just like his mother." Priscilla smiled, happiness filling her despite her fatigue. This was what she had risked everything for that stormy night, not just escape from Charles, but the chance at a real life, a life of her own choosing. As if sensing her thoughts, Dawson looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "They never caught you," he said softly, echoing his words from that first night. "And now they never will." Priscilla nodded, reaching out to take her husband's hand as he sat beside her on the bed, their son cradled between them. "No," she agreed. "Now we're free to be exactly who we were meant to be, together." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. But inside the small house that had become a home, warmth and love created a haven that no storm could threaten, a sanctuary built not of walls and roof but of trust, respect, and the courage to believe in new beginnings. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer fair in Fairhaven had become a tradition, a day when the entire community gathered to celebrate the season's bounty with games, food, and fellowship. Children raced across the town green, their laughter rising above the general hum of conversation and music. Priscilla Bailey stood in the shade of a large oak tree, watching as Dawson helped their son Robert onto the back of a gentle pony for his first ride. At 5 years old, Robert was the image of his father's same blue eyes, same determined set to his jaw, though he had inherited Priscilla's dark hair and quick smile. Beside Priscilla, nestled in a blanket-lined basket, their daughter Elizabeth slept peacefully, oblivious to the festivities around her. At 6 months old, she was a contented baby, already showing signs of her mother's thoughtful nature. "They grow so fast," remarked Martha, Robert's wife and Priscilla's closest friend in Fairhaven. "Seems like just yesterday my Thomas was that size, and now he's helping his father at the store." Priscilla nodded, smiling as she watched Robert's face light up with delight when the pony began to move, Dawson walking alongside with a steadying hand. "It does go quickly," she agreed. "Makes you treasure every moment." Her life in Fairhaven had blossomed beyond her earliest hopes. After Robert's birth, she had started teaching reading and writing to the town's children 3 days a week, fulfilling her old dream of becoming a teacher. Dawson now managed the sawmill, a position that had come with a larger house at the edge of town, complete with a small barn where he kept 2 horses and the beginnings of what he hoped would someday be a respectable horse breeding operation. They had built a good life together, a life of purpose, community, and deep, abiding love. As if sensing her thoughts, Dawson looked up from his position beside the pony and caught Priscilla's eye across the green. He smiled, that same warm smile that had first given her hope on a rainy night that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. They had never heard from Charles Blackwell again after the divorce was finalized. Occasionally, news would reach them through travelers or newspapers about the cattle baron's declining fortunes, bad investments, poor management, and a reputation for cruelty that finally caught up with him when one too many ranch hands ended up dead under suspicious circumstances. Last they had heard, he had been forced to sell most of his holdings to cover his debts and legal troubles. Priscilla felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that his shadow no longer darkened her life. She had moved beyond fear, beyond even resentment. The past was the past, and her present was too full of joy to leave room for old hurts. "Mama, did you see?" Robert called excitedly as Dawson led the pony back toward her. "I rode all by myself." "I saw, darling," Priscilla assured him, reaching out to straighten his cap as Dawson lifted him down. "You were very brave." "Like Papa," Robert declared proudly. "Papa says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." Priscilla's eyes met Dawson's over their son's head, sharing a moment of understanding. They had taught their children about courage not through lectures, but through the example of their own lives, the choices they had made, the risks they had taken for what they believed was right. "Your papa is a wise man," Priscilla told her son, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Now, why don't you go find Thomas? I think Mrs. Jenkins is about to start the sack races." As Robert raced off to join his friends, Dawson moved to stand beside Priscilla, slipping an arm around her waist and peering down at their sleeping daughter. "Still sound asleep," he observed with a smile. "She's got your ability to find peace in the midst of chaos." Priscilla laughed softly. "A useful skill in our household, with a 5-year-old tornado running about." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the community they had become part of carry on around them. Children played, adults chatted, and the simple pleasures of a summer day unfolded in an atmosphere of safety and belonging that once would have seemed an impossible dream to Priscilla. "You ever think about that night?" Dawson asked suddenly, his voice low and reflective. "The night you rode through the storm and found my cabin?" "Sometimes," Priscilla admitted. "Less often now than I used to. But yes, I think about how different our lives might have been if I'd taken a different trail, or if you hadn't been home that night. I thank God every day that you found your way to my door," Dawson said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best thing that ever happened to me was a half-drowned woman showing up in the middle of a thunderstorm." Priscilla turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his cheek gently. "And the best thing that ever happened to me was a cowboy who opened his door to a stranger and said, 'They'll never catch you now.'" Their kiss was brief but tender, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown from such unlikely beginnings. Around them, life continued its cheerful pace. Children laughed, music played, and the future stretched out before them, bright with promise and possibility. They had both taken leaps of faith that stormy night, Priscilla in fleeing into the unknown, Dawson in opening his door to a woman in trouble. Neither could have imagined where those choices would lead, the life they would build together from the ashes of fear and loneliness. But that was the beauty of courage, Priscilla reflected as she watched her husband join their son for the father-son three-legged race. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply take the first step, even when the path ahead was shrouded in darkness and storm. Because sometimes, beyond that darkness, waited a light you couldn't yet see, a light that would guide you home.